what's up you guys, the Curious Owl here, and today I will be reviewing Vampire Academy by Richelle Mead. So for many of you that have been on this channel for a while, you will know that I have done several reread series of series that I had read when I was in middle school and high school, basically to reread them now as an adult and see whether or not the series lived up to what I remember about that series, or if the series did not age nearly as well, especially considering that the time between the first time I read the series and now is a large gap in years. Now, Vampire Academy is kind of in that same category of being a reread series. However, it is a series I never actually finished. I remember reading the first two when I was either in the late high school or early college. I am not 100% certain, but I do know that I never finished the series, and it is one that I have actually countless times over the years really wanted to get back to, because for many people it was a huge staple when it came to anything regarding YA vampire literature. And I am pleasantly surprised with how this went, because I will say now, I gave this 5 stars because truthfully I feel like this book lives up to so many of the expectations I had felt for it, and honestly the amount of twists and turns that it came about within this were surprising to me now, since it has been many years since I read it originally. This is actually way better than most YA series I would even say exist in modern time. I have a distinct feeling that, especially because there's going to be the reboot of the TV series as opposed to there being more movies made of Vampire Academy like there were back in the 2010s, that this is going to make its rounds again on BookTube and Book Talk and Book Twitter, and essentially people are going to recognize the true geniusness of the Vampire Academy series and the spin-off series that was created of it, which was the Bloodline series, I believe. If you've never read Vampire Academy, the main plot of this circles around 2 young adult women, basically about the age of 16, 17, and that is Rose Hathaway, who is what's called a Dhampir, where basically she's half vampire, or in this world half Morai, that is the name that they give the vampires, and she's half human. Her father was a vampire and her mother was a human Dhampir. Now, Dhampirs in this world exist within our real world. They kind of are hidden away though with the Morai or with the vampires, and essentially the Dhampir are the ones that protect the Morai. In this story you learn that the Morai are a very dwindling race of people because unfortunately there are these things called Strigoi, which are kind of the more evil vampires. They're more in line with what you would see as kind of superhuman in a sense. They have heightened abilities, they're very much stronger than the normal Morai, but they also are able to be in the sunlight unlike normal vampires. And unfortunately the Strigoi have become a massive force, and because of that have been killing off many of the Morai, specifically also the ones that are more so in power or are considered the royalty of this world. The Dhampirs are basically trained from young adulthood to protect these Morai. Every person that graduates from the various academies that are across the world specifically for Morai and Dhampir people will end up being paired up with a Morai after graduation to basically protect for life. Now, Rose and Lissa, we find at the very beginning of this, not even on the campus. You learn that there was some very mysterious circumstances surrounding around things that happen at their campus that caused them to leave, and you don't find out what that is until much later in the book. But there's a lot of mysterious circumstances surrounding around Rose and Lissa in particular as well, because you learn very quickly that Rose and Lissa have a very particular bond. It's not 100% a psychic bond, but it is something that Rose is able to tune into a lot easier than Lissa is to tune into with Rose. Rose is able to basically pick up on not only the emotions of Lissa when she's especially in extreme anxiety or distress or anything like that, she's also able to basically see what Lissa sees from time to time, basically placing her mind inside Lissa's and being as a kind of observer from Lissa's body. But Lissa doesn't really know that this is happening. She doesn't really know that this all happens, and she can kind of read her thoughts, not 100%, but the most important thing for her is that she's able to read her emotions a lot clearer, but it's mostly mental. It's a very mentally based link. They don't really know how this happened or why it came about, but they do believe that it has something to do with the mysterious circumstances that were happening around campus that caused them to leave. And unfortunately, they do get captured after having been on the run for about 2 years from the academy and are brought back. And here we meet a main character named Dimitri, who is this 27-year-old Dhampir bodyguard, basically. He was instructed to go after Rose and Lissa and find them and bring them back. And Rose is then put under his tutelage in order to become a stronger Dhampir, because since they had been away from the academy for 2 years, a lot of the training that she was supposed to have is not there. And so she's having to basically go through a very accelerated program to try and catch up with her peers. And over the course of the novel, you really just see the inner workings of the academy, the political system involved within the school itself with the students, and how, you know, the royalty are established here, and how there's a lot of cattiness surrounding around some of the non-royals and the royals, and specifically too how Lissa plays into all of that, because Lissa has always for her entire life been looked at as the possible new queen or ruler of essentially the vampire world. She's always been looked at as that person because her family was very affluent, very wealthy, and very royal. And unfortunately, she lost a lot of her family in an accident years prior, but since then has basically been, you know, the one to look at. And so you really start to see the inner workings of this school and how it affects not just Lissa, but then also Rose. And there's other things that come up in terms of other characters and whether or not they're trustworthy, and there's a lot of backstabbing, and it basically is just a very much high school based story. But it doesn't feel like it's high school, and it actually isn't so trivial as to the fact that I feel like I was wanting to gouge my eyes out with the ridiculousness of the high school antics. There is a lot of talk in this too about things like depression, anxiety, self-harm, suicidal ideation, things of that nature, and there's a lot of alcohol use. There's a lot of talk about sex as well. There's a couple instances that are very steamy scenes within this, so go into this with that mindset, because this is very much more so, in my mind, on the new adult side as opposed to young adult. I feel like there's so much that goes into this that is much more risque than I would expect from a young adult, which is, I think, one of the things I really loved about this. So on a reread, I was, like I said, very surprised with how new adult this felt. For those of you that are not aware, new adult is basically a developing age range within fiction that essentially takes place between the ages of anywhere from like 18 to 25. Think of like your college age range. That's usually the way that people talk about it. And this felt so much more like that, because not only do we see Rose and Lissa as a little bit older people, because they are basically like 16, 17 years old, they're getting to that point where they would be considered young adults, that kind of a thing, but just the overall content within this, especially things about sex, which is not normally seen in young adult. Now, you will typically see more things with sex and alcohol and things like depression and anxiety in more contemporary young adult stories. It's not often you see it in things like young adult fantasy, because there's so much more to do with the world and magic systems that they don't really get brought up a lot in my mind. Now, when it comes to new adult and adult, they are typically the places where you will see more of that content, because not only, especially in fantasy, are you focusing on the world and those things, but it's pretty obvious to most people that there's gonna be some steaminess going on when you get like certain characters that come up and they're like, oh my gosh, you're a powerful warrior, I'm a powerful warrior. There's some like sexual tension there. It's much more apparent in new adult and adult fantasies, because not only is it just more realistic in a sense and kind of grounds the story, but more often than not you have readers who are more age appropriate for those things in terms of the publishing world. Now, that's not to say that young adult isn't necessarily getting to that point where we're starting to see more of that get brought in, especially in contemporary and fantasy alike, but this is a prime example of, I think, something that may not have necessarily been thought of in terms of the content, and like in the sense that I feel like this would have easily been a new adult series had it been marketed a slightly different way. A lot of times for young adult writers, Richelle, Mead included, their stories are picked up by more young adult publishers because they want something that's a little bit more interesting, that's going to catch the eyes of people, and specifically if they also have characters who are in the young adult range, which is usually anywhere between 14 to 21 usually, which goes into the idea of new adult with the fact that you get people that are 18, 19, 20, and 21-year-olds involved. it's more often than not you're going to have a young adult publisher pick up those pieces because those stories are a little bit more relatable for the young adult readers. Unfortunately, though, the amount of content that's involved that involves things like sex, drugs, alcohol, mental health, things of that nature, there are things that typically, normally, I should say, in terms of an audience perspective, are not really looked upon as favorably, which is why a lot of times when you have authors like Richelle Mead that are pushed into the young adult area when in reality their content is a little bit more risque than what you would like for a young adult, you get people who are saying that young adult is, basically making their kids want to have sex and do drugs and all these things, when in reality it's not the author's fault, it's the publishing company that pushes these more adult-based stories into the young adult section when clearly this story included, it should have probably stayed more in an adult range than young adult because of the fact that there's so much involved that is much more adult-based conversation. Again, not necessarily 100% accurate though, because this does have a lot to do with the high school drama that you would see in today's society, and it is no secret that most kids by the time they're 15, 16 years old are having sex and are doing drugs and alcohol and all these things. It's not like this is news to me. It's been happening most of my life. But in terms of a content-based story, the way that this reads just feels much more new adult than young adult. I feel like a lot of times with young adult, I expect there to be a little bit more naivete in terms of the main characters and the things that are, being explored. But this just felt like Rose was way more of a maturer adult, that I feel like that made it feel like it should have been more of a new adult story as opposed to young adult, because the way that the material was brought up in terms of things like depression and anxiety and sex in particular, I felt that it was a conversation that was more mature than how most young adult stories depict these kinds of conversations. Now, I feel like this is honestly a big surprise to me also because the writing was actually way better than I think I remembered it being. I thought that the writing, when thinking back on reading it the first time, was less juvenile. I thought that for some reason the writing in this was going to be very pedantic and juvenile and feeling like my teeth were getting pulled out of my head, basically. But I actually enjoyed it a lot. I felt like I really loved Rose as a character. I felt like she was very interesting. And I felt that just in general, the description of ways that things were happening, it didn't feel pedantic to where I was feeling like I was sloughing through this just because, I wanted to see what happened. I actually was invested in it because the writing didn't make me feel like it was trying to be something it wasn't, if that makes sense. In general, I feel like this is just a really interesting start to a reread/finish series. I think that this was a very strong start. There were a lot of really good things involved in this, and I don't want to spoil anything for those of you that have not read it because, like I said, I know that the TV show is currently being made that is basically a reboot of the original movie that was made of Vampire Academy, which I've never seen, but I have the movie of it, and I'm kind of tempted to watch it because I want to see what it was like. I heard many people say it was not as good as they had hoped it would be because of the way that certain characters were portrayed. I'm a little hesitant about how the TV series is going to go because for many people, like with the Mortal Instruments series that was done as a TV show after the first movie that was made, it was very disappointing in terms of the way that the story was done. So I'm a little hesitant to watch the TV series just because I'm afraid that if I like the movie, the TV series is going to ruin everything. But I guess we'll kind of have to cross that bridge when we get there. But as far as my overall thoughts on Vampire Academy, like I said, it is a 5 out of 5 stars for me. A very strong start to this reread/finish series, and honestly, just way more enjoyable than I would have ever expected it to be, considering that I had originally thought I was probably going to feel lukewarm about this. Now, like I said, I read the first 2 books in this series before never continuing, so I'm very excited to see how the second book goes, because if I remember correctly, the second book was one that made me bawl my eyes out because of the ending of I'm scared, but I'm excited at the same time. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you guys did enjoy it, please do give it a big thumbs up, and let me know if you guys have read Vampire Academy yourself and what you thought of it. And if you guys haven't already and you'd like to be, go ahead and hit that button down below and subscribe to become an owlet in our flock, and I will see all of you guys in my next video. Bye guys!